So, with the beginning of August, uh, another anniversary of the atomic bombings of Japan, and of course, the annual response from the borderline historical communism is better than the war wing of the libertarian movement. Now, I am a libertarian. I do hate war, but war isn't always the trump card that nullifies all other considerations. Now, here's where the anti war libertarians are correct. The standard claim is that atomic bombings prevented 1 million American casualties that would have occurred with an amphibious invasion that would have been required to militarily occupy Japan, assuming Japan continued the fight. That standard claim is wrong, which makes the libertarians right. No invasion of Japan was possible until November of that year. The invasion called for the main islands to be taken in two waves, the first in November of 1945 and the second early 1946. So there was no urgency to drop bombs in August to save American lives in an invasion. And a fun fact, the million casualty figure wasn't a pre invasion projection. After the nuclear bombings, it was clear from polling that average Americans were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the bombings as time went on, and more information became known. The invasion casualty estimate was actually generated to prevent anti bombing sentiment from wrecking Truman's election chances. Now, keep in mind that if no nukes had been used, the Japanese would have still been under enormous military pressure and survival pressure on top of that. Conventional bombings would have continued, and Operation Starvation, yes, that was the name, it was a blockade using mining and ships that had pretty much shut down the importation of food to Japan, and at that time, Japan could not grow enough of its own food. So, if preventing invasion casualties were the primary driver here, it was known that Japan was thinking of capitulating. It was assumed there was a good chance it would happen before November. If all else failed and the Japanese refused to surrender, the bombs could have just as been easily dropped in November as one last ditch effort to convince them to quit before we actually committed the ground troops. So, to restate the point, there was no immediacy requirement in August to use nuclear bombs in order to stop an invasion. So, if there's no linkage to the invasion and the August timeframe, what did drive the August bombings? Well, in short, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. When FDR was driving World War II negotiations in Europe, he believed, or actually, he was operating off of faulty logic. He believed the British and French empires were far greater threats to the spread of democratic style governments than the Soviet Union was. He believed if the Soviets were treated as equals and given generous terms, that they would play nice with his vision of the post World War II order. Over the strenuous objections of the British, FDR ceded the Balkans to the Soviets. Based on his ideas of peaceful coexistence, the idea of a permanent division of Germany into four occupied countries had already been envisioned. FDR's people had already laid the groundwork for something similar to happen to Japan. Per an agreement with the US, the Soviets would begin an invasion of the Japanese held territory 3 months after the war ended in Europe. The full details of post occupational division had yet to be worked out. The droppings of the bombs does coincide with the Soviet entry into the war. Truman got assurances from the Project Manhattan people that they were absolutely sure a live use of the bomb would work. Truman told Stalin that we had a new powerful weapon, and he said this face to face with Stalin at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945. It's generally accepted by historians that Truman's motivations were to minimize Soviet interference with post war Japan. So, if we had dropped nuclear bombs to prevent 1 million Americans from being killed and crippled, Most red-blooded Americans could very much get behind that idea. Vaporizing Japanese civilians to massage the post-World War II order is a lot harder to rally around and difficult to market. So, does that mean the libertarians whose voices go up 2 octaves and scream war crimes are correct? Well, the peace at any cost people have no sense of nuance. So the answer is, it's far more complicated than that. The first issue, where the peace at all cost camp is wrong, comes down to understanding the Japanese government's internal fight over surrendering. Japan was attempting to negotiate with the US via the Russians, who prior to August were in a state of ceasefire. The peace at any cost crowd says the Japanese were trying to surrender. There's a difference. One means terms haven't been met, and the other infers that they have quit and are begging for mercy. The Japanese had definitely not quit and were seeking specific terms. By the way, I consider those terms highly reasonable, and I also consider FDR's unconditional surrender demands to have been one of the gravest evils of the Allied side of that war. But that would be a whole nother video. The second issue where the peace at any cost camp is wrong is that the idea that nuclear bombs had virtually no impact on the decision-making process of the Japanese government. Consider that the Japanese were essentially militarily impotent, and they knew it. Their primary goal of resisting was to leverage negotiations. They were using the Soviets as their intermediary to negotiate with the US. The Soviets joining the war dampened the idea that negotiations were even possible. The Japanese government deeply feared communism. The Soviet troops pushed back the Japanese forces at an alarming rate. Essentially, the Japanese ability to resist in Asia had pretty much collapsed due to lack of food and ammunition and probably morale. The Japanese deeply feared a division of their islands, with a portion being occupied by the Russians. The blockade of Japan was starving them, and they knew they had a time limit before either people revolted or their army became too weak to fight. Conventional aerial bombardment never stopped. Cities were still being bombed between the atomic bombings. The atomic bombings by themselves probably would have had little impact on Japanese government's thinking. Coupled with all the other issues, it very much helped them making the decision. Probably one would call it the tipping point. So this brings us to an issue that the peace at any cost camp covers its ears screaming, la 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 la, I can't hear you. The issue is that yes, Japan was trying to find an off-ramp to the war. However, they had not decided to embrace unconditional surrender. So what happens if the nukes were not dropped at that point? Well, starvation would have continued to occur because they wouldn't have stopped Operation Starvation. The U.S. Army Air Force would have continued to drop bombs. The Russians would be fighting Japanese soldiers in Asia that were probably being told to fight to the death, and it would also cause lots of collateral civilian damage that comes with a major offensive. People would continue to die until the Japanese government finally came around. So there's no guarantee that less people would die in this period than died via nuclear explosions. It's certainly possible that this interim period could have generated more casualties than the bombs. So here's the final item, the better dead than red take. So assuming no nuclear bombs had been dropped, it is highly likely the Soviets would have used the time to gain further concessions. The division of Korea was settled as the Soviets were invading Manchuria. The US was not in a position to land troops in Korea until late September. Without the negotiating power of the nuclear bombs and the quick Japanese capitulation that followed, the Soviet Union would have most likely occupied all of Korea, even if the war had lasted a few weeks longer. What would have happened if the war had lasted a few months later? This is more speculative, but the Soviets might have demanded part of the conquest of the Japanese home islands. If the US agreed to this, the Soviets could have used this as occupational justification, even if the Japanese had surrendered before the invasion. So, without the nukes, there's no guarantee that there are less casualties. And there might have been even more. It's most likely that South Korea would have been occupied by the communists, and it's also possible that portions of Japan might have as well. The areas under communist rule would have certainly had additional deaths due to repression. Nuclear bombs are absolutely an abomination. That is most certain. The question we have to ask is, were the results worse or better with or without the bomb? Better dead than red, do you think? Tell me in the comments section below. I don't have a specific answer myself, but I'd be curious to see what you're thinking. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm's brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please look at my other titles. I get into a lot of things. You'll certainly find something you're interested in. You should subscribe. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.